The morning sun cast long shadows across Horse Guards Parade as tourists began gathering for one of London's most beloved daily spectacles. The mounted sentries of the Household Cavalry had been performing this duty for over 350 years. Their magnificent horses standing as still as their riders in the iconic stone archway that separated Whitehall from St. James's Park. Among the growing crowd was a group of university students from California, led by their self-appointed leader, 21-year-old Brad Thompson. Brad was everything that annoyed locals about certain American tourists: loud, entitled, and convinced that his study abroad semester made him an expert on British culture. His designer sneakers, expensive university sweatshirt, and constant need to document everything on social media marked him as someone who treated travel as a personal photo opportunity rather than a cultural experience. The two mounted guards sat motionless on their horses in the ancient stone archway, their scarlet tunics and plumed helmets creating a striking image against the weathered stonework. These were not actors or performers, but serving soldiers from elite cavalry regiments, chosen for their exceptional horsemanship and unwavering discipline. Their mounts were equally impressive, carefully selected and extensively trained war horses, capable of remaining calm in almost any situation. Trooper Sarah Henderson sat astride her black gelding. Wellington, a 7-year-old Irish sport horse who had been serving with the Household Cavalry for 3 years. Wellington stood nearly 17 hands high, his powerful frame and intelligent eyes reflecting the careful breeding and training that went into every cavalry mount. Both horse and rider had undergone months of specialized preparation for this duty, learning to ignore distractions while remaining alert for genuine security threats. On the opposite side of the archway, Trooper Michael Davies rode Britannia, a bay mare whose calm temperament and steady nerves had made her one of the most reliable horses in the regiment. At 8 years old, Britannia had seen everything from screaming children to aggressive photographers. Maintaining her composure through countless interactions with unpredictable tourists, the horses were trained to stand perfectly still for hours at a time, their military conditioning allowing them to ignore almost any distraction while their riders maintained ceremonial guard duty. This wasn't simply a matter of good behavior. These animals were working members of the military, with responsibilities as important as any human soldiers. Brad approached the archway with his phone already recording, speaking loudly to his camera as if narrating a nature documentary. So here we are at Horse Guards, where they have these guards on horses just standing around all day. I'm going to see if I can get some cool shots with them. His companions Jessica, Tyler, and Madison followed behind him with their own phones and cameras, creating a small mob of American voices that immediately drew attention from other, more respectful tourists. Their behavior was already marking them as the type of visitors that guards and local PSD's authorities dreaded dealing with. A clearly posted sign near the archway read, "Beware horses may kick or bite. Do not touch the reins or horses." The warning. It was written in multiple languages, including English. But Brad barely glanced at it as he positioned himself for his first selfie attempt. These horses are so well trained, they're basically like statues, Brad announced to his followers, completely missing the fact that Wellington's ears had already begun to twitch with irritation at the loud American voices. I bet I can get right up close to them for some amazing shots. Other tourists in the area began to notice Brad's group, many of them stepping back slightly as they recognized the warning signs of problematic behavior. A British family with 2 young children moved to a more distant viewing position, the father quietly explaining to his wife that some tourists didn't understand proper protocol around military animals. The guards themselves remained motionless, but years of training allowed them to assess the developing situation through peripheral vision and heightened awareness. Both Sarah and Michael could sense their horses' subtle changes in posture and breathing that indicated growing stress from the loud, aggressive behavior of the approaching tourists. Wellington, despite his military training, was still a living animal with natural instincts and emotional responses to threatening behavior. The combination of loud voices, sudden movements, and invasive camera work was beginning to trigger stress responses that even his extensive conditioning couldn't completely suppress. A Horse Guards tourist information volunteer, Elderly Margaret Collins approached Brad's group with the diplomatic smile she had perfected over 5 years of dealing with difficult visitors. "Excuse me, young people, but I need to remind you about the safety protocols around our cavalry. Horses. These are working military animals, and they require appropriate respect and distance." Brad barely looked at her, too focused on getting the perfect angle for his social media content. "Yeah, sure, whatever, I'm just taking some pictures. The horses are fine, look how calm they are." But Wellington was not calm. His ears were now pinned back slightly, and his weight was shifting in the subtle way that experienced horsemen recognize as a warning sign. Sarah could feel the tension building in her mount through the barely perceptible changes in his posture and muscle tension beneath the saddle. Jessica stepped closer with her phone, attempting to take a close-up video of Britannia's bridle and decorative tack. "Oh my God. Look at all the fancy stuff they put on these horses. This is going to get so many likes." The constant flashing of phone cameras and the aggressive behavior of the students was creating exactly the kind of situation that the warning signs were designed to prevent. Multiple stressors were combining to push the well-trained military horses toward their breaking point. Despite their extensive conditioning and natural calm temperaments, other tourists began pointing and whispering about the Americans' behavior, with several taking their own photos and videos of what was clearly becoming an inappropriate interaction with the ceremonial guards. The contrast between Brad's group and the respectful behavior of other visitors was becoming more obvious by the minute. The stage was set for a confrontation between military discipline and tourist entitlement, with two highly trained war horses caught in the middle of a situation that would test their training, their nerves, and ultimately their patience with human foolishness. The situation continued to escalate as Brad's group became increasingly bold in their attempts to create viral content. What had started as typical tourist photography was rapidly evolving into a deliberate provocation of the military horses and their riders. The other tourists in the area began forming a loose semicircle around the developing drama, many of them recording what they sensed would become a significant incident. Tyler, emboldened by Brad's aggressive approach, decided to take things further. "Watch this," he announced to his friends while live streaming to his social media followers. "I'm going to see how close I can get to this horse's face for the ultimate selfie." He stepped directly in front of Wellington, holding his phone just inches from the horse's muzzle while making exaggerated facial expressions for his video. Jerky movements triggered every instinct that Wellington's military training had been designed to suppress. Wellington's nostrils flared as he took in the unfamiliar scents and aggressive energy of the tourist. His ears pinned back completely now, and his powerful muscles began to tense beneath Sarah's saddle. The horse's breathing became more rapid and shallow, clear warning signs that any experienced horseman would recognize immediately. Sarah felt every change in her mount's demeanor through the subtle communications that exist between trained riders and their horses. Years of partnership had created an almost telepathic connection between them, and she could sense Wellington's growing stress and agitation. However, her duty required her to remain motionless and silent unless a genuine security threat emerged. Margaret Collins, the volunteer guide, made another attempt to intervene before the situation spiraled completely out of control. "Young man, you're far too close to the horse. These animals are trained for military service, but they're still living creatures with natural defensive instincts. Please step back to a safe distance immediately." Tyler laughed dismissively while continuing to film himself with Wellington's head as a backdrop. "Relax, lady. It's just a horse. You wouldn't put them here if they were dangerous, right? Besides, I'm not touching anything. I'm just taking pictures." His logic was flawed and dangerous. The horses were indeed military assets, but they were also powerful animals capable of inflicting serious injury if provoked beyond their tolerance limits. The fact that they were usually calm and well-behaved didn't mean they lacked the ability to defend themselves when threatened. Madison joined Tyler in front of the horses, both of them now competing to create the most outrageous content for their social media audiences. She began making loud noises and sudden gestures, trying to provoke some kind of reaction from the stoic animals that would make her videos more entertaining. "Come on, horsey," she called out loudly, waving her arms dramatically.
"Do something."
"Interesting. Your job is to entertain tourists, isn't it? Her fundamental misunderstanding of the guards' role, they were active military personnel. It's not entertainment, reflected the entitled attitude that was driving their increasingly dangerous behavior. The horses were not performers existing for tourist amusement, but working military. Animals with serious responsibilities and inherent rights to respectful treatment. Britannia began showing her own signs of stress under the constant harassment. Her tail swished more frequently, and she shifted her weight from foot to foot in the subtle way that indicated mounting anxiety. Michael could feel his mare's tension building through the reins in his seat, her usual rock-steady composure beginning to crack under the sustained provocation. A group of British tourists nearby began expressing their disapproval more vocally. "This is completely inappropriate," muttered an elderly gentleman wearing a Royal Navy veteran's pin. "These young people have no respect for our military traditions." A middle-aged woman with her teenage daughter stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had reached her limit. "Excuse me, but your behavior is unacceptable. These are working soldiers and military horses, not props for your social media nonsense." Brad turned toward her with an expression of mock surprise and genuine irritation. "Mind your own business, lady. We're just taking some pictures. This is a public place, and we have every right to be here." "You have the right to be here respectfully," she replied firmly. "You don't have the right to harass military personnel or endanger these animals with your reckless behavior." The exchange was drawing even more attention from passers-by, creating a growing audience for what was becoming an international incident involving American tourists and British military traditions. Several people were now actively recording the confrontation, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would likely have lasting consequences. Jessica, not to be outdone by her friends, decided to escalate her own behavior. Britannia from the side, holding her phone up for a close-up video of the horse's ornate ceremonial tack. The elaborate leatherwork and brass fittings of the military bridle made for impressive footage. But her aggressive filming technique was pushing the mare past her comfort zone. "Look at all this fancy military stuff," she narrated loudly for her video. "I wonder how much all this gear costs. It must be worth thousands of dollars just for one horse." Her commentary revealed another layer of cultural insensitivity, reducing centuries of military tradition and craftsmanship to mere dollar values for social media consumption. The ceremonial tack wasn't just expensive equipment, but symbols of British military heritage that deserved appropriate reverence rather than casual evaluation for entertainment value. Wellington's patience was reaching its absolute limit. The combination of constant camera flashes, loud voices, aggressive movements, and invasive behavior was overwhelming his military conditioning. His training had prepared him to ignore normal distractions, but this sustained harassment was beyond anything he had been prepared to handle. Sarah could feel her mount's muscles coiling like springs beneath her, every fiber of his being preparing for some kind of response to the continued provocation. Her own training kept her in position. She was calculating how quickly she might need to regain control if Wellington decided he had endured enough abuse from the American tourists. The crowd of observers continued to grow as word spread through the tourist area that something dramatic was developing at Horse Guards. Many visitors who had come to respectfully observe British military tradition were instead witnessing a confrontation that would test the limits of both military discipline and animal patience. The stage was set for Wellington and Britannia to deliver their own response to the sustained harassment, and everyone present seemed to sense that the situation was approaching a critical breaking point that would have consequences far beyond a simple tourist incident. The atmosphere around Horse Guards Parade had become electric with tension as more tourists gathered to witness what was clearly becoming an unprecedented confrontation. The usual reverent silence that surrounded the ceremonial guards had been replaced by an undercurrent of nervous energy as onlookers sensed that something significant was about to happen. Brad, completely oblivious to the mounting danger, decided to push his social media stunt to new levels of inappropriateness. He had noticed that his live stream viewer count was climbing rapidly as word spread about the Americans harassing the Queen's Guard horses, and his ego was driving him to provide even more dramatic content for his growing audience. "Check this out, everyone," he announced loudly to his phone camera while approaching Wellington from directly in front. "I'm going to get the ultimate selfie with this royal horse. This is going to break the internet." He extended his selfie stick toward Wellington's face, the metal rod coming within inches of the horse's sensitive muzzle and eyes. The combination of the unfamiliar object, the aggressive movement, and Brad's continued loud commentary was pushing the well-trained military horse. Beyond his breaking point, Wellington's entire body language had transformed over the past 10 minutes. His ears were now completely flattened against his head. His nostrils were flared wide, and his powerful neck was arched with tension. Most telling of all, his eyes were showing white around the edges, a clear warning sign that any experienced horseman would recognize as immediate danger. Sarah felt her mount's muscles bunching beneath her, every fiber of his being preparing for action. Her military training had taught her to read the subtle communications between horse and rider, and Wellington was sending unmistakable signals that his patience had reached its absolute limit. Tyler and Madison had positioned themselves on either side of Britannia, creating a triangle of harassment that was overwhelming both horses simultaneously. They were taking turns making sudden movements and loud noises, competing to see who could provoke the most dramatic reaction for their social media content. "Maybe we should try touching them," Madison suggested with the thoughtless bravery of someone who had never experienced the full power of an angry horse. "I mean, what's the worst that could happen? They can't do anything with those guards on their backs." Her complete misunderstanding of both horse behavior and military protocol was about to be corrected in the most dramatic way possible. The worst that could happen was far beyond anything her privileged suburban upbringing had prepared her to imagine. Margaret Collins, the elderly volunteer guide, made one final desperate attempt to prevent what she could see was about to unfold. "Please, all of you, step back immediately. These horses are showing clear signs of distress, and someone is going to get seriously hurt." Her warning was based on decades of experience around horses and years of observing tourist interactions. With the cavalry, she had seen minor incidents before, but nothing approaching the sustained provocation that Brad's group was inflicting on Wellington and Britannia. Horse Guards Police Constable P.C. James Wright had been alerted to the developing situation and was making his way through the crowd toward the Americans. His trained eye immediately recognized the danger signals that the tourists were completely ignoring. Both horses were displaying classic pre-aggression behaviors that demanded immediate intervention. "You lot need to step away from the horses right now," P.C. Wright called out with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This is your final warning before I arrest you for endangering military personnel and disrupting a ceremonial guard." Brad turned toward the approaching officer with the same dismissive attitude he had shown everyone else who had tried to intervene. "We're not doing anything wrong, officer. We're just taking some pictures." "These horses are part of a tourist attraction, aren't they? These are working military animals, not tourist attractions," P.C. Wright replied firmly, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio to call for backup. "And you're creating a dangerous situation that needs to end immediately." But it was already too late. Wellington had reached the end of his remarkable patience and military discipline. A combination of sustained harassment, invasive behavior, and aggressive movements had finally overwhelmed his training. In one explosive moment, centuries of selective breeding for war and decades of military conditioning came together in a response that would be remembered by everyone present. Wellington reared up on his hind legs, his massive frame rising nearly 8 feet into the air as he let out a thunderous whinny that echoed off the ancient stone walls of horse guards. The sound was like nothing most of the tourists had ever heard, a primal roar of anger and warning that spoke to instincts buried deep in human genetic memory. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and dramatic. Screams erupted from multiple directions as tourists scrambled backward, many of them falling over each other in their panic to escape the suddenly dangerous situation. Phones and cameras scattered across the cobblestones as people prioritized their safety over there. Documentation efforts. Brad, who had been directly in front of Wellington when the horse reared, found himself staring up at over 1,000 pounds of angry military horse towering above him. His selfie stick clattered to the ground as his survival instincts finally overcame his social media obsession. But he was too paralyzed by fear to move out of the danger zone. Sarah, demonstrating the exceptional horsemanship that it earned. Her selection for ceremonial duties maintained perfect control of her rearing mount while keeping her own position in the saddle. Her years of training with Wellington created a partnership that allowed her to channel his anger into a controlled display rather than letting it become truly dangerous. Wellington's front hooves came down with a thunderous crash on the cobblestones. Mere inches from where Brad stood frozen in terror. The message was unmistakable. The horse could have easily struck the tourist. But his training and Sarah's control had turned his natural aggression into a powerful warning rather than actual violence. The sound of Wellington's hooves hitting the stones was like gunshots in the suddenly quiet courtyard. Every person present understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. A moment when military discipline and animal instinct had combined to deliver a lesson in respect that would not be forgotten. Britannia responding to her stablemate's display and her own mounting frustration. Stomped her front feet repeatedly against the cobblestones while tossing her head and snorting loudly. The combined display from both horses created an atmosphere of barely controlled power that sent clear warnings to anyone foolish enough to continue their harassment. The American students stood frozen in shock, their phones forgotten as they faced the reality that their harmless social media stunt had provoked. Genuine anger from two highly trained military horses. The gap between their expectations and reality had been bridged by over 1,000 pounds of equine fury. PC Wright was already moving toward Brad's group with backup officers responding to his radio call, but the horses had delivered their own justice more effectively than any human authority could have managed. The lesson in respect had been taught in the ancient language of power and consequence that transcended cultural barriers and entitled attitudes. The aftermath of Wellington's dramatic display was immediate and profound. The courtyard, which moments before had been filled with the confident chatter of entitled tourists, was now dominated by stunned silence broken only by the heavy breathing of the two military horses and the scattered whimpering of shocked onlookers who had witnessed genuine animal power unleashed. Brad remained frozen in place, his face pale with terror as he stared up at Wellington, who was still snorting and pawing the cobblestones with barely controlled energy. The reality of how close he had come to serious injury was slowly penetrating his shocked consciousness. The selfie stick lay broken at his feet, its expensive technology reduced to scattered pieces of plastic and metal. Sarah maintained perfect control of her mount. Her years of training allowing her to channel Wellington's righteous anger into a controlled demonstration rather than letting it escalate into actual violence. Her hands were steady on the reins, her seat secure in the saddle, and her voice calm as she whispered soothing words to help her partner regain his composure. "Easy, Wellington. Good boy. You've made your point," she murmured, her words audible only to her horse, but her professional handling of the situation visible to everyone present. The partnership between horse and rider had never been more evident than in this moment of controlled crisis. PC, James Wright reached the group of American tourists with 3 backup officers, their presence immediately establishing a protective barrier between the students and the still agitated horses. His years of experience in crowd control and tourist management had prepared him for many situations. But the dramatic display he had just witnessed was unprecedented in his career. "Right, that's quite enough of this nonsense," PC Wright announced. With the authority of someone whose patience had been exhausted by the morning's events, "You lot are under arrest for disturbing the peace, endangering military personnel, and harassing ceremonial guards." Tyler, Jessica, and Madison were still in various states of shock, their social media devices forgotten as they tried to process what had just happened. The contrast between their confident harassment of the horses just minutes earlier and their current terrified submission was stark and complete. "We didn't do anything wrong," Jessica protested weakly, her voice lacking any of the confident aggression she had displayed earlier. "We were just taking pictures. How are we supposed to know the horses would go crazy?" PC Wright's expression hardened as he addressed her complaint. "You were warned repeatedly by multiple people about appropriate behavior around military horses. You chose to ignore those warnings, and continue harassing these animals until they felt compelled to defend themselves. The crowd of tourists who had gathered to witness the confrontation began to disperse slightly, though many remained to document the arrest of the Americans and discuss what they had just experienced. The general sentiment among the onlookers was overwhelmingly supportive of the horses and critical of the students' behavior. "Serves them right," muttered an elderly British woman to her husband. "Those horses showed more restraint than I would have in the same situation. Young people today have no respect for anything." A German tourist who had been recording the entire incident approached one of the officers. "I have video evidence of everything that happened, including their harassment of the horses and the warnings they ignored. I'm happy to provide this as evidence if it's needed." Similar offers came from multiple witnesses, all of whom had documented various aspects of the Americans' inappropriate behavior and the horses' eventual response. The case against Brad's group would be supported by extensive video evidence from multiple international sources. Wellington was gradually returning to his normal composure under Sarah's expert handling, though his ears remained alert and his eyes continued to track the movement of the tourists who had harassed him. His message had been delivered with unmistakable clarity, and his military training was reasserting itself over his natural protective instincts. Britannia, following Wellington's lead, also began to settle back into her ceremonial stance, though both horses remained more alert than usual. The incident had tested their training and discipline in ways that normal ceremonial duties never approached, and they had responded with a perfect balance of controlled aggression and professional restraint. Michael Davies, Britannia's rider, finally broke his ceremonial silence to address the officers handling the arrest. "Constable, both horses are returning to normal, but I recommend maintaining increased distance from tourists for the remainder of our duty period. They've been significantly stressed by this incident." His professional assessment carried the authority of years of experience with military horses, and PC Wright immediately implemented additional crowd control measures to prevent any repetition of the harassment that had triggered the dramatic response. Margaret Collins, the elderly volunteer guide who had repeatedly tried to warn the American students, approached the officers with a mixture of relief and frustration. "I've been doing this job for 5 years, and I've never seen tourists behave so badly or ignore so many warnings. Those horses showed remarkable restraint." The arrest process was swift and professional, with each of the 4 American students being read their rights and prepared for transport to the local police station. Their study abroad program coordinators would be notified, or universities contacted, and their actions documented as part of an international incident involving British military personnel. Brad, as the apparent leader of the group, faced the most serious charges. His live-streamed harassment of Wellington had been viewed by thousands of people in real time, creating a digital record of his behavior that would follow him long after his legal troubles were resolved. "I want to call the American embassy," he demanded as handcuffs were applied, his voice still shaky from his close encounter with Wellington's hooves. "This is all a misunderstanding. We didn't know we weren't supposed to get close to the horses." PC Wright's response was measured but firm. "Sir, there were clear warning signs posted in multiple languages, and you were warned repeatedly by our volunteer guides and security personnel. Claiming ignorance won't excuse your behavior when there's video evidence of you ignoring those warnings." The incident was already being uploaded to social media platforms by the numerous witnesses who had recorded various aspects of the confrontation. Within hours, the hashtag #HorseGuardsJustice would be trending internationally as people shared their reactions to the dramatic footage of Wellington's powerful response to tourist harassment as the American students were led away toward waiting police vehicles. The atmosphere around horse guards gradually returned to its normal reverent calm. Other tourists maintained respectful distances from the horses, many of them clearly having learned important lessons from witnessing the consequences of inappropriate behavior. Wellington and Britannia resumed their ceremonial positions, their duty continuing despite the dramatic interruption. Their response to sustained harassment had been measured, controlled, and ultimately educational for everyone present. They had defended their dignity and their riders' honor while maintaining the professional standards expected of military horses. Incident would become legendary within the household cavalry, It's a perfect example of how military training and natural animal instincts could combine to deliver justice. It's more effectively than human intervention alone. Within hours of their arrest, the American students found themselves at the center of an international social media storm that would define their reputations for years to come. The incident at Horse Guards had been captured from multiple angles by dozens of tourists, creating a comprehensive digital record of their harassment of the military horses and the dramatic response that followed. At Charing Cross Police Station, Brad sat in an interview room that was a far cry from his comfortable university dormitory back in California. The fluorescent lighting and institutional furniture served as a stark reminder that his study abroad adventure had taken a serious turn toward legal consequences that his privileged background hadn't prepared him to handle. Detective Sergeant Lisa Morgan, a veteran officer with 15 years of experience handling tourist incidents, reviewed the extensive evidence that had been collected. The case file was unusually thick for what might have initially appeared to be a minor disturbance, but the video evidence and witness statements painted a clear picture of sustained harassment and willful disregard for safety warnings. Detective Sergeant Morgan began as she entered the interview room with Brad's court-appointed solicitor. You've been charged with disturbing the peace, endangering military personnel, and harassment of ceremonial guards. The evidence against you is substantial and comes from multiple independent sources. Brad's expensive university sweatshirt looked wrinkled and inappropriate in the institutional setting. His usual confident demeanor had been replaced by nervous anxiety about his situation. The reality that his actions had serious legal consequences was beginning to penetrate his entitled worldview. This is all blown way out of proportion, Brad protested, his voice lacking the aggressive confidence he had displayed at Horse Guards. We were just taking some pictures for social media. How could we know that the horses would freak out like that? There should have been better warning signs or barriers or something. His attempt to shift responsibility away from his own actions was met with professional skepticism by Detective Sergeant Morgan, who had dealt with countless tourists trying to minimize their inappropriate behavior after facing consequences. Mr. Thompson, we have video evidence showing that you were warned repeatedly by volunteer guides, security personnel, and other tourists about your behavior. You chose to ignore those warnings and continue harassing the horses until they felt compelled to defend themselves. The solicitor, David Patterson, had reviewed the evidence and recognized that his client's best option was to accept responsibility and seek a reduced sentence through cooperation. Mr. Thompson, I must advise you that the evidence against you is overwhelming, and your best course of action is to consider a guilty plea. Meanwhile, the viral videos of the incident had exploded across social media platforms with unprecedented reach and engagement. The hashtag HorseGuardsJustice was trending globally as millions of people shared their reactions to Wellington's dramatic warning and the Americans' shocked responses. Comments on the various video posts were overwhelmingly supportive of the horses and critical of the students' behavior. Those horses showed more restraint than I would have, wrote one user. Finally, some justice for disrespectful tourists, commented another. The international consensus was clear. The horses had delivered appropriate consequences for inappropriate behavior. Back at Horse Guards, the incident had become a teaching moment for both military personnel and tourist management. Colonel James Whitfield, commanding officer of the Household Cavalry, conducted a thorough debrief with Sarah Henderson and Michael Davies about the unprecedented situation they had handled so professionally. Trooper Henderson, Colonel Whitfield, addressed Sarah in his office at Hyde Park Barracks. Your handling of Wellington during that incident was exemplary. You maintained perfect control of a highly stressed animal while allowing him to deliver an appropriate response to sustained harassment. Sarah stood at attention, accepting the commendation with the professional humility that characterized her. Military service. Thank you, sir. Wellington's response was measured and controlled despite significant provocation. His training held throughout the incident. Horses themselves had returned to their normal routines, though their handlers noted that both Wellington and Britannia seemed more alert and confident in their interactions with tourists. Their successful defense of their dignity and their rider's honor had reinforced their sense of purpose and professional pride. The study abroad program that had brought the American students to London was facing its own crisis as news of the incident reached university administrators back in California. Program coordinator Dr. Sarah Williams received angry calls from parents, university officials, and British education partners about the behavior of students under her supervision. This is exactly the kind of incident that damages international education relationships. Dr. Williams explained to her supervisor during an emergency video conference, "These students' actions have created a diplomatic and public relations nightmare that will affect our program for years to come." The university began immediate procedures to remove all 4 students from the study abroad program and send them back to California, where they would face additional disciplinary action. Through the student conduct system, their actions had not only resulted in legal consequences, but had also jeopardized educational opportunities for future students. Jessica, Tyler, and Madison sat in adjacent holding cells at the police station, their social media devices confiscated, as evidence and their confident personas completely deflated. The reality of facing criminal charges in a foreign country was sobering for young people who had never experienced serious consequences for their actions. "I can't believe this is happening," Madison whispered to Jessica through the bars separating their cells. "My parents are going to kill me, and this is going to ruin everything. What if I can't get into graduate school because of a criminal record?" The consequences they were beginning to contemplate extended far beyond their immediate legal troubles. Criminal convictions could affect their ability to travel internationally, their eligibility for professional licenses, and their future career prospects in ways they were only beginning to understand. Tourist behavior around ceremonial guards had been permanently changed by the viral videos of Wellington's response. Visitors to horse guards now maintained significantly more respectful distances from the horses, and the number of inappropriate incidents dropped dramatically as word spread about the consequences of harassing military animals. Margaret Collins, the volunteer guide who had repeatedly tried to warn the Americans, found herself somewhat famous as one of the voices of reason in the viral videos. News organizations interviewed her about tourist behavior and respect for British military traditions, giving her a platform to educate future visitors about appropriate conduct. "Those horses are not decorations or photo props," she explained. To a BBC reporter, "They're working military animals with important jobs and natural instincts that deserve respect. What happened that day was entirely preventable if those young people had simply listened to the warnings they received." The international media coverage of the incident sparked broader conversations about tourist behavior, cultural respect, and the responsibilities that come with travel privileges. The horses had become unlikely symbols of the importance of treating local customs and institutions with appropriate dignity. Within 48 hours of the incident, the American students were facing the full weight of British justice, international embarrassment, and educational consequences that would affect their futures in ways they were only beginning to understand. Their harmless social media stunt had become a cautionary tale about the importance of respecting cultural boundaries and heeding safety warnings. Wellington and Britannia, meanwhile, had resumed their ceremonial duties with renewed respect. From tourists and enhanced reputation within military circles, their measured response to sustained harassment had perfectly demonstrated the balance between military discipline and natural protective instincts that made them ideal ceremonial horses. 6 months after the incident that would forever change how tourists interacted with the Queen's Guard horses, the legal proceedings reached their conclusion at Westminster Magistrates' Court. The courtroom was filled with international media representatives and legal observers who had followed the case through its extensive social media coverage and diplomatic implications. District Judge Margaret Harrison had presided over thousands of tourist-related cases during her distinguished career, but few had generated such widespread public interest or represented such a clear example of entitled behavior meeting British justice. The evidence presented during the trial had been overwhelming, with video footage from dozens of sources documenting every aspect of the Americans' harassment of the military horses. Brad Thompson sat in the dock wearing a conservative dark suit that his parents had insisted he purchase for the court appearance, a stark contrast to the university's sweatshirt and arrogant demeanor he had displayed at Horse Guards 6 months earlier. The months of legal proceedings, international embarrassment, and academic consequences had visibly aged him beyond his 21 years. Mr. Thompson, Judge Harrison, addressed him directly, her voice carrying the authority of decades of legal experience. You have pleaded guilty to disturbing the peace, endangering military personnel, and harassment of ceremonial guards. Your behavior, as documented in extensive video evidence, showed complete disregard for British law, military traditions, and basic animal welfare. The sentence that followed would serve as a precedent for future tourist misbehavior cases involving British military ceremonies. Brad was fined £8,000 for the primary charges, with additional penalties for his live-streamed harassment and willful disregard of safety warnings. Most significantly, he was banned from all royal properties and ceremonial sites in the United Kingdom for 15 years. The court wishes to emphasize, Judge Harrison continued, that the horses in question, Wellington and Britannia, showed remarkable restraint in their response to your sustained provocation. Their military training prevented what could have been a much more serious incident involving significant physical injury. Jessica, Tyler, and Madison received similar sentences, though with slightly reduced fines due to their follower rather than leader roles in the harassment. All 4 students were required to complete extensive community service hours, working with animal welfare organizations upon their return to the United States. The financial consequences extended far beyond the court-imposed fines, legal fees. Early return travel costs and the termination of their study abroad program had cost each family tens of thousands of dollars. The expense of their harmless social media stunt had grown to exceed what many families spend on entire college. Education's more devastating than the financial impact was the long-term damage to their academic and professional prospects. All 4 students had been expelled from their study abroad program and faced disciplinary action at their home university. Graduate school applications and job interviews would forever include questions about their criminal convictions for harassing British military personnel. The viral nature of the incident meant that their names and faces were permanently associated with disrespectful tourist behavior. A simple Google search would immediately reveal videos of their harassment of the horses and Wellington's dramatic response, creating a digital record that would follow them for decades. Back at Horse Guards, the incident had become a legendary example of military horses defending their dignity and their riders' honor. Wellington and Britannia were celebrated throughout the household cavalry as exemplars of proper military bearing under extreme provocation. Their measured response had perfectly balanced animal instincts with military discipline. Trooper Sarah Henderson was promoted to Lance Corporal. In recognition of her exceptional handling of Wellington during the crisis and her continued exemplary service, the promotion ceremony took place at Hyde Park Barracks, attended by fellow cavalry personnel who had been impressed by her professional management of an unprecedented situation. Lance Corporal Henderson, her commanding officer, announced during the ceremony, "Your partnership with Wellington during that incident demonstrated the finest traditions of the household cavalry. You maintained perfect control while allowing your mount to deliver appropriate consequences for unacceptable behavior." Wellington himself had become something of a celebrity within military circles, his dramatic rearing and thunderous warning serving as a perfect example of how military horses could defend themselves and their riders while maintaining professional standards. Its response had been featured in cavalry training programs as an example of controlled aggression in defense of military dignity. The incident had fundamentally changed tourist behavior around all ceremonial guards throughout London. Visitors now maintained significantly more respectful distances from both mounted and foot guards, and incidents of harassment dropped by over 80% in the months following Wellington's viral response. New signage was installed at all ceremonial sites, featuring prominent warnings in multiple languages about the serious consequences of harassing military personnel or their horses. The signs included QR codes linking to videos of Wellington's dramatic warning. providing visual education about what could happen to disrespectful tourists. Margaret Collins, the volunteer guide who had repeatedly tried to warn the American students, found herself in demand as a speaker at tourism conferences and cultural education seminars. Her patient attempts to prevent the incident captured in the viral videos made her a symbol of responsible tourism advocacy. The most important lesson from this incident, she explained to a conference of international tour operators, is that prevention through education is always preferable to consequences through confrontation. So those horses delivered justice, but it could have been avoided if the tourists had simply listened to the warnings they received. The horses' response had inspired changes in military ceremonial protocols worldwide. Other nations with similar traditions began reviewing their own procedures for dealing with disrespectful tourists, often citing the horse guards incident as an example of appropriate boundaries and consequences. Wellington and Britannia continued their ceremonial duties with enhanced respect from visitors and elevated status within military ranks. Their perfect balance of restraint and response has created a new standard for military horses dealing with civilian harassment. Tourism. Industry organizations began using the incident as a case study in cultural respect and appropriate behavior abroad. The dramatic footage of Wellington's rearing and the Americans' shocked responses became powerful educational tools for teaching travelers about the importance of respecting local customs and institutions. 5 years after the incident, Brad Thompson was working in a small marketing firm in a mid-sized American city, his dreams of international business success permanently damaged by his youthful arrogance and disrespect. Job interviews inevitably included discussions of his criminal conviction for harassing British military personnel, limiting his career opportunities in ways he was still discovering. The other 3 students faced similar long-term consequences, their professional prospects forever shadowed by their association with one of the most widely viewed examples of tourist misbehavior in social media history. Their 15 minutes of viral fame had become a lifetime of professional embarrassment. Wellington and Britannia had become legends within the household cavalry and symbols of military dignity throughout the British armed forces. Their measured response to sustained harassment had perfectly demonstrated that respect must be earned through appropriate behavior, and that even the most patient military animals have limits that should not be tested. The incident served as a permanent reminder that cultural institutions deserve reverence rather than exploitation, and that military traditions represent centuries of honor and sacrifice that demand appropriate respect from visitors. The horses had delivered this lesson more effectively than any human authority could have managed. Using the ancient language of power and consequence that transcends cultural barriers and entitled attitudes years later, tourists visiting horse guards would often ask guides about the American students and the angry horses, ensuring that the lesson in respect and consequences would be passed down to future generations of travelers. Wellington's thunderous warning had become an enduring, a symbol of the importance of treating others, whether human or animal, with the dignity they deserve.